Order. Urgent question. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs if he will make a statement on the conviction of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong.
Assistant Debate. Well done. Minister of State Mark Field. Oh, we're very accustomed to seeing the right honourable gentleman at the box recently. He's well and truly earning his keep. Well,
thank you. It's either here, the Middle East, or indeed Turkey earlier on at Westminster Hall today. So, Mr. Speaker, at the outset, I should like to emphasise to the right honourable gentleman, but also to the House, that the UK government is acutely aware of its and our enduring responsibilities to Hong Kong. We were a joint signatory to upholding the joint declaration between the UK and China some 35 years ago. This joint declaration is, of course, lodged with the United Nations. As such, we remain absolutely committed to monitoring and ensuring the faithful implementation of that joint declaration and indeed the principle of one country, two systems. I should like to reassure the House that we clearly and consistently raise our concerns with the Chinese and the Hong Kong authorities. Parliament is updated on developments in Hong Kong through our 6-monthly reports submitted by the Foreign Secretary, most recently indeed on the 27th of March, so just over a fortnight ago. We always stand ready to comment publicly and robustly where appropriate. Yesterday, the Hong Kong courts gave their first verdict on the 9 key figures in the Hong Kong Occupy movement. These protesters were arrested after large-scale protests in 2014. Yesterday, each was found guilty on at least one public nuisance offence. Now, such offences carry a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison. We shall have a better understanding of the severity of the sentence and therefore the signal that this purports to send to others who choose to exercise their rights under Hong Kong's Basic Law and the Bill of Rights once sentences are handed down. Sentencing is due on the 24th of April and the defendants have the right to appeal. It would therefore not be appropriate to comment further or in detail on those ongoing legal cases. Suffice to say that there is a very protracted, potentially protracted legal process that may take a matter of years rather than months. Now, I have visited Hong Kong twice as a Foreign Office Minister and have held meetings with a number of senior legal figures. When I visited most recently in November last year, I raised the issue of the rule of law directly with the Deputy Chief Justice, as well as with representatives from the legal, political and business communities. All staunchly defended the independence of the judiciary, and it remains our position that Hong Kong's rule of law remains robust, largely thanks to its world-class independent judiciary. And many members will perhaps know that indeed Baroness Hale, Lord Hoffman and others are part and parcel of that overseas panel that is based in Hong Kong. Hong Kong citizens are guaranteed the right to freedom of assembly and demonstration under the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 and indeed the Basic Law. And in a democracy, it is essential that these rights are properly respected. Hong Kong's success and its stability depend upon its high degree of enduring autonomy and indeed a respect for the fundamental rights and freedoms that are enshrined in the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. The Foreign Secretary pronounced recently that he was concerned that on a civil and political freedom, Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy is now being reduced. It would, Mr. Speaker, be deeply concerning if this ruling discourages legitimate protest in the future or indeed discourages Hong Kong citizens from engaging in political activity.
Mr. Carmichael.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer and say I hope that he will be as robust in his tone when speaking to the Chinese government as he has been in his remarks to the House today. This prosecution and now conviction of 9 leaders of the Umbrella Movement is just the latest in a series of egregious human rights abuses by the government in China. Using the criminal justice system and public order offences in this way is an abuse of fundamental and internationally protected human rights. Amnesty International point out that these convictions all stem solely from non-violent direct actions in largely peaceful protests. The Minister's noble friend Lord Patten said, and I quote, "It is appallingly divisive to use anachronistic common law charges in a vengeful pursuit of political events that took place in 2014. So will the Minister make the strongest possible representations to the Chinese government that this conviction is not just an abuse of human rights of these activists, but also of China's treaty obligations? This country has both a moral and a legal responsibility to pursue this matter with all vigour. We made commitments to the people of Hong Kong at the time of the handover to China, and we still have these commitments under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. The One Country, Two Systems framework promised the people of Hong Kong progress towards democracy, but this conviction is not an isolated incident. Over the last 5 years, we have seen Hong Kong booksellers who published titles critical of China's rulers abducted. We've seen a political party banned, a senior Financial Times journalist, Victor Mallet, expelled from the city, and now we see proposals to change Hong Kong's extradition laws to enable suspected criminals to be extradited from Hong Kong to mainland China, something that not only political activists but actually business people also fear, as they believe that they could be in danger if this change goes ahead. So, Mr. Speaker, will the government stand by the people of Hong Kong and their human rights, and will he ensure that we in this country do not allow the Chinese government to break the promises that this country made to them?
Minister of State.
May I thank the right honourable gentleman for his considered comments, and may I say that I fully accept and agree with the concerns that he has raised. We do take very seriously our responsibilities under One Country, Two Systems, and as I've pointed out, consecutively at 6-monthly reports, we have expressed concerns that there has been a tightening in relation to those individual rights, whilst we also feel that actually, as far as commerce and the judicial system's independence is concerned, that has remained true to the One Country, Two Systems. Mr. Speaker, if I may just say this, I believe it is in China's own interests that Hong Kong continues to succeed under that framework. The Joint Declaration must remain as valid today as it was when it was signed 3.5 decades ago. It is, as I say, a legally binding treaty that is registered with the United Nations. I've raised this and will continue to raise this with Chinese counterparts, and obviously there is some criticism that is addressed at the FCO in relation to the idea that we have a 6-monthly report. We feel it is a particularly important foundation for the ongoing confidence within Hong Kong that we take very seriously the responsibilities to which we are signed up. Mr. Speaker, may I just come on, if I may touch on this issue of the change to extradition law that was raised by the right honourable gentleman. We are aware that the Hong Kong government has a proposed change to legislation, and we are very seriously considering the potential implications of those changes, including how those proposals might affect UK citizens and indeed our own current extradition arrangements with Hong Kong. The British Consular General in Hong Kong, the very talented man Andy Hayne, has spoken to senior figures in the Hong Kong's administration to seek clarity on what these proposals would mean for UK citizens, but also for our law enforcement cooperation and the current extradition arrangements. He has raised the potential impact of the proposals on business confidence in Hong Kong and explained our concern that given the sensitivity of these issues raised by these extradition proposals, more time, considerably more time, should be given for a full and wide consultation with interested parties before the Hong Kong authorities seek to put it into law.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my right honourable friend's excellent statement, he emphasised the importance of the independence of the judiciary in Hong Kong, with judges of the calibre of Baroness Hale and Baroness Hoffman. If the Chinese government wish to be really believed that they are upholding the standards, highest standards of human rights, isn't it absolutely essential that that court is allowed to do its duty with full independence?
May I thank my honourable friend from the Cotswold, who I know takes these matters very seriously and obviously has worked hard on these matters. Indeed, he was heading a delegation that I first went to mainland China some 15 years ago, and I'm well aware that he keeps an eagle eye on what is happening, particularly, obviously, in Hong Kong. He is absolutely right, and I have to say, as I say, when I was there most recently, I had a chance to speak to senior legal figures who do feel that the judicial system and its independence is being upheld. But clearly, the sense in which other rights are being are being questioned and are being eroded by the Chinese authorities does raise some concerns in that regard. But as I say, hitherto I think we have been confident that cases that have come before the Hong Kong judiciary have been dealt with in a fair way without political interference.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to you for granting this urgent question, and I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland for securing it. I share his profound concern at yesterday's verdict. A serious discussion in this House on the situation in Hong Kong is overdue. China's erosion of the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Hong Kong Basic Law has been growing since the pro-democracy umbrella movement protests in 2014. The last few years has seen an increasing crackdown on dissent and protest. Political parties banned, pro-democracy candidates blocked, and journalists expelled. The conviction of 9 leaders of the Hong Kong umbrella movement yesterday, who could face 7 years in prison for organising peaceful protests, is totally disproportionate and clearly politically motivated. The proposals to change Hong Kong's extradition law means they could serve sentences thousands of miles away in mainland China. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a legally binding treaty registered with the United Nations, and the British government is the joint guarantor with China of the rights of Hong Kong citizens. So I have one simple question to the Minister. How is the government going to fulfil its legal responsibilities to the citizens of Hong Kong?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution. And may I also say I was very sorry to hear that her constituency office was attacked over the weekend. I think it's something that is unacceptable in the world in which we live. And it's perhaps also a salutary reminder that some of the concerns that we deal with across the world also become quite prevalent closer to home. May I just say this? We do take very seriously one country, two systems, and we'll continue to do so. And indeed, the fact that we are the guarantor is important. As I say, the 6 monthly reports come not without criticism from our Chinese counterparts, but that does, I think, provide a very detailed opportunity, and I would encourage members who have an interest in Hong Kong, and even those perhaps who don't have a strong interest in it, to read that report when it comes out every 6 months. It does give, obviously, very specific concerns that are addressed, and indeed specific cases, including a number of those that the Honourable Lady has raised. The work that we will continue to do, obviously from London and from Hong Kong and indeed from Beijing, is important as we try to maintain the one country, two systems approach. Our own view, as I say, is it is very much in China's interest, and I think implicitly they have recognised the importance of Hong Kong as a financial capital market, but also as an important business centre. And it is, I think, therefore equally important that we address upon it that the uniqueness of Hong Kong will only be properly maintained and the full potential if the rights that are set out in the Joint Declaration to ensure that the two systems is every bit as important as the one country aspect.
Ah, yes, a noted sinologist, linguist and cerebral denizen of the House, Mr. Richard Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the 6-monthly Foreign Office report on Hong Kong, which is circulated by the all-party China group that I have the honour to chair, does, of course, recognise close bilateral Hong Kong-UK relations on culture and trade in many sectors. But the Minister is right to highlight the continuing pressures on Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy. Could my right honourable friend confirm, in relation to the pro-democracy activists found guilty of public nuisance, that the appeal process is still very much open and that the higher courts, including, if needed, the Court of Final Appeal, will take into consideration, indeed must take into consideration, the freedoms of assembly and speech guaranteed under the Joint Declaration?
I'm very happy to confirm that to my honourable friend for Gloucester. As I've said, we very much highlight our hope that a range of recent court rulings do not discourage lawful protest in the future. Let me just stress this. Hong Kong citizens are guaranteed the right to freedom of assembly and demonstration under that Joint Declaration and the Basic Law.
Stephen Gethins.
Mr. Speaker, can I express my solidarity with the member for Bishop Auckland and in particular her constituency staff? and also thank the member for Orkney and Shetland for bringing this important matter. And we share his concerns about democracy and human rights. As the Minister said, the UK has a particular responsibility for Hong Kong and our ongoing commitment to democracy and the rule of law. And I would reflect the concerns of Amnesty International, who said of this case that it was a crushing blow for freedom of expression and peaceful protest in Hong Kong. Does he agree with me that judicial independence is absolutely critical to commercial investment and certainty, and is in the interests of China as well? And secondly, what discussions about Hong Kong has been undertaken with his colleagues in terms of any trade talks, and what reassurances have ministers sought over China's commitment to Hong Kong's autonomy and the independence of the legal system?
I would very much agree with what the honourable gentleman says, and may I thank him for his comments. And I know we are often criticised for speaking endlessly about trade and other opportunities, and clearly in relation to Hong Kong, this was very much a mercantile base for the UK from the 1840s onwards. But we don't in any way take lightly the importance that also has to be addressed towards human rights, particularly for those who are living within Hong Kong. We've made it very clear that we do feel that actually for Hong Kong to fulfil its potential, and indeed for China to fulfil its potential in areas such as the Belt and Road, it's very clear that having the independence, indeed dare I say it, the sense of a common law system, a British legal system, is seen as more reliable for many investors than perhaps going to the rather more doubtful systems, or at least less orthodox systems within Shanghai or elsewhere. And I think the interesting fact was that whilst Pudong and Shanghai is a very important financial centre for Hong Kong, for China, and does a lot of work obviously in relation to domestic work, there is still a sense of confidence that Hong Kong enjoys for much international capital markets work. I think in terms of the specifics in a post-Brexit world of free trade agreements, clearly Hong Kong would be something that would be towards the top of the list given the strength of the relationship we have. And I think we have made it very clear to China. We feel that one of the reasons we want to see one country, two systems be properly promoted is that we think it's very much in the interests of China's own plans for its own economic development in the years to come. But may I thank the honourable gentleman for what he's had to say, but I would not wish by his focus on this particular issue that we should not deny that obviously the issues of human rights will remain extremely important and will continue to be so as far as our own commitment to one country, two systems is concerned.
Fiona Bruce.
Yesterday's convictions are extremely concerning, involving as they do a 75-year-old pastor, Reverend Chu, declared himself as a peaceful protester, and also Benny Tai, who was invited by me to speak at the Conservative Party conference at a fringe event last year, and who spoke of the erosion of academic freedoms in Hong Kong. Does the Minister agree that the proposed new extradition laws in Hong Kong, which may result in political activists and even potentially international business people being in danger of extradition to mainland China, would fundamentally undermine Hong Kong's autonomy, do irreparable damage to the one country, two systems view, and destroy business confidence in Hong Kong as a result? Isn't it in all our interests, especially business, to defend Hong Kong's freedom, autonomy and rule of law, which underpin its status as an open international financial centre?
May I thank my honourable friend for Congleton, who speaks so knowledgeably about these issues, particularly in relation to Hong Kong, but also China as a whole. Let me reassure her, it remains the UK government's view that for Hong Kong's future success, it is absolutely essential that it enjoys and is seen to enjoy the full measure of the high degree of autonomy and the rule of law as set out in that joint declaration and enshrined in the basic law and in keeping with the commitment to one country, two systems. I referred earlier in response to the right honourable gentleman for Orkney and Shetland issues around the current extradition law that is being planned, and it's a good example actually of where difficult cases make for tough law, because as you may be aware, this has come about simply because of an important case where an individual was murdered in Taiwan and the accused has ended up in Hong Kong, and there hasn't been obviously an extradition treaty in place. And for that reason, that obviously, given that Taiwan is obviously regarded as part of one China, that suddenly this becomes an issue with far greater implications. I believe, as I'm sure my honourable friend does, that it is important for any changes to extradition arrangements from Hong Kong to mainland China that they must respect Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and cannot and must not affect the rights and freedoms set out in the joint declaration.
Mangum, debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for what he said so far, but can I press him a bit further on the Sino-British Joint Declaration? How confident is he really that China is respecting it as legally binding? And if he feels that they are not, which is my observation, what steps is his department taking in order to represent the UK government's view that it should be legally binding on the Chinese government?
May I thank the Honourable Lady. I'm going to be seeing her later on this afternoon, I think, in Westminster Hall on other matters. It's been one of those busy days. Let me say this. Obviously, we are concerned by some of the comments that are coming through from the Chinese government about the Joint Declaration. Our view is this. It is and must remain as valid today as it did when it was signed over 35 years ago. It is a legally binding treaty, as has been pointed out, registered at the UN and continues theretofore to be in force. We are committed to monitoring its implementation closely, and we'll continue to do so. Yes, of course we're concerned. You only need to look at the last half a dozen or so 6 monthly reports to recognise we do think there is a deterioration in the way in which China are looking at this particular issue. But we will stand up for the rights of all Hong Kong people. And as I say, I think it is actually in the interests of China, and it is an important part of that process is to make it very clear that it is to ensure that one country, two systems prevails.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
About 100 years after the first Chinese legation was established in London in 1877, I was at a gathering with the then Chinese Chargé, where he made an elegant joke in Greenwich about how East meets West. I think the same thing can be true about Hong Kong. Can my right honourable friend make it clear that if there's more than a nominal sentence, and if there's an absence of a chance to appeal against the convictions, people will think that the declarations that matters of principle agreed with the Chinese are not being properly fulfilled, and that will affect both the future of prosperity of Hong Kong and how people see China?
Honourable friend for his comments. I'm not sure quite what I was doing 42 years ago, but I know he was already a member of this House at that time. But he makes a very valid and fair point. I mean, he is absolutely correct that actually it is vitally important that we maintain that for the interests of all Hong Kong citizens today and in the future, and we'll continue to make the robust case, which I think is absolutely essential.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, you will recall that in 2014, at the height of the Umbrella Movement protests, a Foreign Affairs Committee delegation from this country was prevented from going to Hong Kong by the Chinese embassy, and it is clearly a matter that the Chinese Communist authorities are extremely sensitive about any scrutiny and any questioning that we raise in this House and in our committees. So can I ask the Minister, when he meets his counterparts from the Chinese government, can he emphasise to them that in this country we have a pluralistic parliamentary democracy, and that is what the people of Hong Kong also wish to have?
I remember that the Chinese government's obstruction at that time was regarded across the House as thoroughly reprehensible. I also recall that the Chinese embassy had the greatest possible difficulty in grasping the concept of an independent parliament. I think some re-education was required. Minister.
I think some of us get rather concerned by an independent parliament, particularly those of the executive at any one time, but that's another matter, of course. I remember being on the back benches for many, many years, Mr. Speaker, so I don't in any way criticise you. No, I think I very much agree with what the Honourable Gentleman for Ilford South has had to say. No, we do need to do our level best to ensure that we stand up for our rights. I don't think the Chinese are entirely unknowing of this, of course. They know exactly what is going on and want to squeeze those rights. But it is interesting that in in a significant number of areas, they recognise the benefit, as I say, of two systems, whether that's commercially, the idea of a settled rule of law that will allow capital to come into to Hong Kong. And we need to do our level best to try and ensure that all aspects are maintained, and we shall do so.
Victoria Prentice.
And actually, just following on from what you said, Mr. Speaker, I was heartened by what the Minister had to say earlier about the correlation between free trade negotiations for the future and our continuing pressure about human rights. Could he confirm to me that when we talk about the rule of law with Chinese interlocutors, that we mean our international definition of the rule of law rather than theirs?
I think my honourable friend is obviously trying to get herself onto the next trip I take to Hong Kong, as I will need it explained in much more succinct style than I'm used to. But I think she is absolutely right. We do recognise that at a time, actually, when, dare I say it, the rules-based international order is coming under increasing threat, indeed from some unexpected quarters as well, that we need to work together with many of our counterparts to ensure that we make that argument as robustly as we can.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister in his opening remarks made it quite clear that the Hong Kong judicial system had integrity and was robust, and evidenced that through his talks that he had when he visited with senior legal figures. And in the same breath, he's saying that the system is being undermined. Can I ask him how the system is undermined or being undermined, and what evidence he has for that?
Thank the Honourable Member for Preston. I think we were actually in a trip to Hong Kong more years ago than I'd like to imagine, about 13 years ago, I think, when it was the first time I went there as a parliamentarian. The concern that we have is that it is the right to protest, as you say, some press rights. Some members have referred to the issue actually of the very sudden withdrawal of the visa of Victor Mallet, the Financial Times journalist. There are a number of those areas of what we would call civil rights. But I think as far as the legal system is concerned, there's a sense that remains independent. But equally, obviously, we are concerned. And I would just say that in relation to the judgments that took place yesterday, there is likely to be quite a long and winding road of appeals that will take place over some considerable time. It's one of the reasons why we are not commenting directly on this, because obviously we want to read the full judgments, but recognise that there will be appeals, I think, from virtually all of the defendants.
Bob Blackman.
Speaker, peaceful protest and the right for free expression are fundamental parts of democracy. And recently, China has not only put pressure on Hong Kong, but also Taiwan as well. So will my right honourable friend impress on the Chinese government that it is totally and utterly unacceptable to try and distort the position in Hong Kong, and that as Hong Kong acts almost as a gateway for China in terms of investment, it is important that they understand that we will stand up for the people that we seek to protect?
Thank my honourable friend for Harrow West, Harrow East rather, and I would very much agree with what he has to say. I think it is actually important to make a distinction between Taiwan and Hong Kong, in much as we are concerned about increasing pressure being put on Taiwan. The Hong Kong situation is different. It is set out in a joint declaration, and indeed, the whole idea of the one country, two systems that came into place in July of 1997, that absolutely protects the position of Hong Kong. And I think there is a slight danger, dare I say it, in trying to equate the situation in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and it may well be in the Chinese government's interest so to do, that we potentially then undermine the Hong Kong situation. Hong Kong's rights are set out, and it is the UK government's responsibility, as we've all pointed out, to make sure that they are maintained.
Geraint Davis.
Yeah, the Minister says he will do what he can, and we'll do what we can to defend human rights alongside our counterparts. But doesn't he accept that our ability and strength in defending our fundamental values of democracy, human rights and the rule of law, which we share across Europe, will be less in the event that Britain Brexits? And people who voted in 2016 didn't anticipate the sort of a muscular, aggressive, authoritarian approach of China that's now seeing extradition, that's seeing the arrest of people of peaceful protest, is seeing Canadian nationals facing the death sentence, and is seeing us basically in a much more vulnerable position, having to rely on trade with China and therefore turn a blind eye to human rights. So doesn't he think that the people should have the right now to a public vote on the deal in light of this emerging evidence of abuse?
And just when we thought we got away from the Brexit debate, here we are. Let me say this, if I may, to the honourable gentleman. I think he makes a fair point in this regard, that we must not take our eye off the ball on standing up for human rights when we are looking at trade agreements going forward. But I'm actually much more optimistic and hopeful than he is, and I say this obviously from the perspective of a Foreign Office Minister. We will have to work, and we are working hard, and we'll need to redouble our efforts as we leave the European Union to make sure that the strongest relationship in a range of multilateral organisations is maintained, whether it's the United Nations in both New York and in Geneva, whether it is in organisations such as the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD. But I'm very confident that we will rise to that challenge, and it's certainly important that we keep as much of a connection open as we can. For example, in the UN at the moment, both France, obviously as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but Germany and Poland, important partners in the European Union, are now on the Security Council this year, and we are working extremely closely with them, and I'm sure we'll do so for some considerable time to come.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is deeply concerning that the Hong Kong government recently rejected the renewal of the visa of a Financial Times journalist. And so would my right honourable friend agree with me that upholding the freedom of speech and also the freedom of press is essential for Hong Kong's way of life?
Yeah. No, absolutely. We were particularly concerned, as I say, by the Hong Kong authorities' unprecedented rejection of a visa extension. It was actually a small visa extension for the senior British journalist Victor Mallet, who's now, of course, the Paris correspondent, and it was just simply a matter of the last 2 or 3 months of his time in Hong Kong that was at stake. And in the absence of an explanation from the authorities, we can only conclude, as my honourable friend for Taunton Dean rightly points out, that this move was politically motivated. I believe it undermines the basic idea of the freedom of speech within Hong Kong, and indeed the freedom of the press, which are, as I say, guaranteed by that joint declaration.
Paul Sweeney.
Speaker, the creation of Hong Kong was a fantastic example of British-Sino cooperation and building a global city that's a massive player in the global economy. And indeed, the Sino-British Joint Declaration itself was a great achievement of cooperation, and it was done with great sacrifice on the British side. After all, Hong Kong Island and Kowloon were perpetually British territory. It was done for practical reasons and diplomatic reasons. So can he reassert the continuing mandate that Britain has to ensure that the Sino-British Joint Declaration is respected until July 2047, and what practical steps will he outline to achieve that?
Hear, hear. Well said.
I think it's a very good point, and in many ways, actually, the agreement, the joint declaration, the Sino-UK discussions, I think, were a fantastic template for broader cooperation, and it is, I think, regretted, and to our regret, that it is now under the pressure that it is, and we will continue, obviously, to stand up for it. I just think, if I may, just on this point, Mr. Speaker, just to say that obviously there's been also speculation in relation to what might happen in the broader region around Shenzhen, Guangzhou, all being linked together as a particular region along with Hong Kong. Again, we will obviously keep our eye on exactly what changes are being potentially made in that regard. Although actually one can see the importance of the interconnections economically within the broader region, and I shall certainly be in what is called the Greater Bay Area. It's an area I'm looking to visit later this year, to go, as I say, to Guangzhou, to Shenzhen, but also to go to Hong Kong at the same time. And obviously we'll look to report back to the House after that time.
And David Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as someone who's actually grown up in Hong Kong, I'm quite concerned about this progression of extradition that may occur to these people who are currently seeking some kind of appeal. What can the Foreign Office actually do to stop any extradition from Hong Kong to China?
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, this is a live debate at the moment because of a particular case, and it is very much at a preliminary stage. And the lobbying that we've had from our own Consular General, or the lobbying that he has received from business connections, makes it very clear that there is a reduction in broader confidence. Can I just say more generally on the rights of British national overseas passport holders? He will be aware that the right of abode in the UK is, of course, defined under the Immigration Act of 1971, and only British citizens and certain British subjects have that right. However, there are, as I say, ongoing responsibilities that we have to Hong Kong citizens, even those who are not, do not enjoy that right of abode, and we intend to make sure up till 2047 and potentially beyond that we will make the strongest of case that we can to ensure that they're properly upheld.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, I also thank the Minister for his response. China is guilty of some of the worst human rights abuses and religious persecution in all of the world. Minister, what discussions, in your discussions you've had with the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government regarding the verdict of guilty, what has been done to secure the trio's release and the impending imprisonment of the other 6, whose only crime has been to promote democracy as part of the 50 years autonomy and freedoms promised by the Chinese government when the Hong Kong was handed over in 1987? China often says no, but they act in a different way.
Well, we very much hope and would understand that given the nature of the alleged offences and indeed given the protracted legal process, that any individuals will not be held in custody but will have a right to a reasonable bail within short order. And as you rightly points out, 3 I think are already have been released, and I very much hope the other 6 will be, and we will be keeping an eagle eye on this issue. But above all, we trust that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Government will continue to make every effort to ensure the environment in which both the media but also individuals operate is conducive to freedom and freedom from any sort of self-censorship or the like. Our officials in both Hong Kong, London and, may I say it, in Beijing, and of course we have a number of consulates general within China that are nearer to Hong Kong, will continue to monitor these issues that he raises very closely.
Ben Lake. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to echo the concerns expressed from both sides of the House that in light of recent developments, the rights of the citizens of Hong Kong are being eroded. But can I ask the Minister about the Government's view on the steps that the Chinese authorities should now take to allay such concerns and indeed to restore faith that these fundamental freedoms and indeed democracy in Hong Kong are not under threat?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for Kennedy again. I think that's a very thoughtful contribution. In many ways, this is something that I'm working with our Hong Kong office, our Hong Kong desk at the Foreign Office, but actually also with our Consulate General on, because I think it is actually rather important that we try and work through a pathway rather than just stepping back and taking a view that we don't like what's going on. Let's try and work together in a constructive way. And as I alluded to earlier on, I think the whole issue around the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is a good example of an area where working together to make sure that Hong Kong's freedoms are maintained will actually be in China's own interest. But I think that it's not just in trading terms, but I very much hope that we can see, if I were Chinese as well, you might think there's an important opportunity to utilise Hong Kong as a chance for experimental changes in freedoms that may or may not be in the mind of this or indeed of future Chinese regimes. So this is a lot of work that is in progress, and I'm working closely with my counterparts on it.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question.